Today we will be graphing quadratic functions and then also telling whether a graph opens up or down. So let's take a look at our first problem here. And I see that we have a y equals negative x squared plus 2. So the way we're going to end up graphing these, we're going to make a table. So here's how the table goes. We have x values, which we consider our inputs. And then we have our function here, which is negative x squared plus 2. And then once we do that work inside that function, once we plug the x value in and do some work and solve, we'll end up with y values. And so the points we're going to end up picking are 2, we're going to pick 1, we're going to pick 0, negative 1, and negative 2. And what we'll notice about this when we're doing these problems is that when we do one of them, we're going to get the same answer for a different one. So we'll see that as we're doing these. So look for that. So let's take a look at the first one here. We're going to go ahead and whenever we see a minus sign in front of an x squared, treat this as negative 1 times by, and now put some parentheses in place of the x squared, and then put the plus 2. Now do this work in your head. It'll make the problem a little bit easier for you. It'll be less messy inside this middle column here if you do this work in your head. 2 in for x, and then square it. What do you get when you square 2? Well, squaring 2 gives you 4. And so then we have 4. So 4 times negative 1 gives me negative 4. And then negative 4 plus 2, that gives me negative 2. Well, what I want you to notice is when we try negative 2, we get the same answer. So let me show you how. See, if I plug in back into the equation, my equation is negative 1. And then I'm going to put negative 2 in here, except that I want to figure out what that is first when I square it. So let's do that. And then I'm going to add that too. So let's go ahead and do that work. If I put in negative 2 in place of x, let's see what we get. What is negative 2 squared? So if I take negative 2 and I square it, what do I get? Well, negative 2 squared is positive 4, the same answer for positive 2. And so I'm going to get the same answer. See, negative 1 times by 4 gives me negative 4 plus 2 gives me negative 2. So I get the same answer. Well, let's try 1. When I plug in 1, I do negative 1 times by 1, which I'll put inside here, but I got to square it first, plus 2. Well, what do we get when we square 1? We get 1. And so 1 times negative 1 makes negative 1. Negative 1 plus 2 gives me 1. Well, I get the same answer for negative 1. Watch. See, if I plug in negative 1 in for the squared portion, when I square that value, let's see what we get. Negative 1 squared. Well, negative 1 squared is just 1. 1 times negative 1 is negative 1 plus 2 gives me 1. So I get the same answer. So I get the same answer for these. These are the same. And I also get the same answer for these two right here. These are the same as well. Well, 0 is going to be a lone one because there is no opposite of this value. Well, 0 squared is just 0, so there's no opposite of that. And so 0 times negative 1 makes 0, plus 2 makes 2. So we have 2. So now we can plot these points. So here we have it. 2, negative 2. So I go over 2 spaces to the right, and I end up going down 2. Over here I have also negative 2 and negative 2. Let's go down and do that one. You see how if I go 2 spaces to the left, I go down 2. Well, if I plug in 1, I'm going to go up 1 space. So over 1 to the right, up 1. And then 1 to the left. And then 1 up puts me right there. And then 0, 2. I go over 0 and then up 2. And so from there, I've got my graph. My graph is a U-shaped graph. And notice that it has symmetry. Symmetry is when it's the same on another side. And it's symmetrical about this y-axis in this case. And so we've got a name for this graph. This graph is called a parabola. And a parabola has a few different components to it. It's got this point right here in which it changes directions. Here it's going up to the right, but then here it changes directions, goes down to the left. That's called the vertex. I have one more thing I want to point out, and that this ends up opening down. So we say opens down. Alright, well, let's take a look at some other ones here. We've got y equals x squared minus 3. So we're going to do the same sort of graph. So let's go ahead and set that one up. We've got our x value that we're going to put in there. We've got our x squared minus 3, and we've got y. And so we're going to go ahead and pick the same values for x, or same inputs. And we'll do the same sort of work. So we're going to pick 2, 1, 0, -1, -2. So we're first going to plug in a number in for this x value, and that's going to be the x value that we picked. In this case 2, but we're going to square it first and then put it in the parentheses. So 2 squared makes 4. 4 minus 3 makes 1. So we just have to do a one step in our head as we do this using this method. And so over here, if we plug in -2 and we square that, -2 squared is 4. 4 minus 3 gives me the same answer. So we go ahead and plug in a 1, square it, we get 1. 1 minus 3 gives me -2. Well, -1 squared also gives me 1. -1 times -1 is 1. 1 minus 3 gives me -2. 0 squared was just 0. 0 minus 3 gives me -3. So now I've got my points. I can go ahead and plot. So over 2 spaces to the right, up 1. Over 2 to the left, up 1. Over 1 to the right, down 2. Actually, that was to the left. Over 1 to the left, down 2. Over 1 to the right, down 2. And then we have over 0, just down 3. So we've got our same sort of shape. But there's a difference. Not only are the points in different spots, something else is different about this. What do you notice? Well, I notice that this opens up. And why do you think this one ended up opening down while this one opened up? And try to think about why that is. We'll go over that answer in just a moment. Let's take a look at the last one of this type, though. Maybe you'll be able to figure it out once we do this one. So we go ahead and pick the same values. We've got our x values. We've got our function, -x squared plus 4. And then we've got our y values. So we're going to pick the same values, 2, 1, 0, -1, -2. And we just go ahead and plug the points in. But remember, this minus sign in front of x squared is the same as -1 times by x squared, and then plus 4. So that's what we're going to be doing each time. -1 times by x squared plus 4. -1 times by x squared plus 4. And so instead of putting the number and then squared, I'm going to do that work in my head. So -1 times by x squared plus 4. And another -1 times by x squared plus 4. So let's go ahead and plug the numbers in. 2 squared. 2 squared gives me 4. So I'm going to put 4 right here. And so 4 times -1 gives me -4. -4 plus 4 gives me 0. So I'm going to get the same answer here. So if you plug in -2 for x, you square it, you get 4. And -1 times 4 makes -4. 4 plus -4 makes 0. And so when I plug this one in, I have 1 squared. 1 squared is 1, but I need to multiply by negative, which gives me -1. -1 plus 4 gives me 3. And so same thing on this next one. When I plug in this -1, I square it, I get 1. -1 times by 1 gives me -1. -1 plus 4 gives me 3 again. Well, 0 squared is 0. 0 times -1 is 0, plus 4 gives me 4. So now I've got some points. So when I go over 2 spaces to the left, I go up 0. Over 2 spaces to the right, I go up 0. 1 space to the left gives me 3 spaces up, and 1 space to the right is 3 spaces up. 0 spaces over, well, that gives me 4 spaces up. So now I've got the graph, and it's just a parabola. And does the same thing as the first one. Well, this one ends up opening down. What do you think causes it to open down? Well, let's take a look at the two equations. Well, on these two equations that open down, notice what do they have in common? What they have in common is this minus sign right here. that minus sign, whenever the x squared term is negative, when we have a negative x squared, that forces it to open down. And that's what it was, because notice this one was a positive x squared. This was a positive x squared term, and that opened up. And that's the concept that we're going to use. However, it only works when y is by itself, when it's y equals. And that's what the next directions are asking us. They say, tell whether the graph of each quadratic function opens upward or downward. Well, what we need to do first is you need to solve for y. So we're going to write that down. Must solve for y first. So once we solve for y, we're going to look at this concept right here that I wrote out, and I'll highlight here in green. And so if it's a positive x squared, it opens up. Negative x squared, it opens down. Let's take a look at this first one. Here, y equals, so this is good. It's all set equal to y. You see it's a positive x squared. So this one opens up. The reason is it had a positive 8x squared when y was by itself. Over here, y is not by itself. We have to do some work. So here I got to subtract that 2x. I also need to add this 4x squared. And so let's see what we have now. We have y equals, now I'm going to write this in descending order from highest exponent to lowest. So it's 4x squared minus 2x plus 5. Now does this open up or down? Let's take a look at that x squared term. It's a positive 4x squared. It's positive 4x squared. So it opens up. So if it's a positive 4x squared, it's going to open up. Positive number opens up, negatives open down. Let's take a look at the last one here. Here, y is already by itself, so no work to do. We have a negative, oops, this should have been an x squared. Let's make that x squared there. Negative 1/2 x squared. So whenever it's a negative 1/2 x squared, and this minus sign does it right there. And then so we'd say, so it opens down. So the negative sign ends up doing the opposite of squaring it. Well, not really opposite of squaring, but squaring it gives it a positive number. The negative term here makes it so we multiply by a negative, so it'll make that term negative. So that's why that opens down. So those are the problems you're going to see on tonight's homework. Good luck.